It was one of those quiet, cold evenings when the wind pressed against the diner windows, carrying the sound of rain tapping gently on the glass. Inside, the soft hum of old ceiling fans mixed with the faint buzz of a radio, playing some forgotten tune. The place wasn't fancy, just a small roadside diner where tired travelers stopped for coffee, and locals came when they didn't want to cook at home. The waitress had been working since morning. Her apron was wrinkled and her shoes had lost their shine long ago, but her smile stayed the same. She had learned long ago that people came not only for food, but for a kind word or a little warmth. The job didn't pay much, but she liked how she could make someone's day just by being kind. It was around 8 in the evening when the door creaked open and a man stepped inside. The rain followed him for a second before the door shut. His clothes were soaked, his jacket torn at the sleeves, and his hair looked like it hadn't been brushed in weeks. He carried no bag, no umbrella, nothing but a small look of uncertainty on his face. The few customers inside turned to look at him. One man at the counter frowned and whispered something to his friend. Another woman pulled her purse a little closer. The cook peeked through the window from the kitchen and raised an eyebrow. Everyone could tell he was homeless. The waitress noticed the way he hesitated by the door, unsure if he was even allowed to come in. She felt something stir inside her, a quiet ache of understanding. She had seen people like him before, but something about his eyes felt different. There was no anger in them, no bitterness, just a quiet tiredness, the kind that comes from walking too long and having nowhere to go. She walked over with her usual calm smile. "Hey there," she said softly. "You can come sit down. It's warm in here." He nodded, barely speaking, and walked slowly to the far corner booth. His hands trembled a little as he sat down. The waitress noticed how carefully he placed them on the table, as if afraid to leave marks. She brought him a glass of water. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked. The man looked up, his voice low and rough. "I don't have any money," he said quietly. "Not right now, but I could work for it. Or maybe just have a small cup of coffee if that's all right." Her heart softened even more. The diner had strict rules, no free food, no exceptions. The owner had made that clear. But looking at him now, she couldn't bring herself to say no. "Don't worry about it," she said gently. "I'll bring you something warm." He looked surprised. His eyes searched hers, trying to understand if she was serious. When he saw the kindness there, his lips trembled slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't know how much that means." She smiled and went to the kitchen. The cook frowned when she asked for an extra plate. "You feeding him for free again?" he muttered. "Just this once," she said quietly. "He looks like he hasn't eaten in days." The cook grumbled something under his breath but handed her a bowl of hot soup and some bread. She carried it to the man's table and placed it in front of him. The man stared at the meal for a long moment before picking up the spoon. He ate slowly, almost reverently, as if each bite was something sacred. The waitress went back to wiping tables but couldn't help glancing at him from time to time. There was something about the way he held himself, graceful in a strange way, even though his clothes were worn and his hands rough. When he finished the soup, he looked around the diner. His eyes stopped at the far corner where an old upright piano stood against the wall. The wood was scratched and several keys were yellowed with age. It hadn't been played in years. Most people didn't even notice it anymore. He looked back at the waitress and raised his hand slightly, as if asking for permission to speak. She walked over, smiling. "Was it good?" He nodded. "It was more than good. Thank you." Then he glanced toward the piano. "That piano," he said quietly. "Does anyone play it?" She shook her head. "Not really. It's just for decoration now. Half the keys don't even work," he smiled faintly. "Would you mind if I tried it? I used to play a long time ago. Maybe I could earn the meal that way." The waitress looked around. The cook was cleaning up. 2 customers were still there, sipping their coffee and whispering about something. She hesitated. The owner didn't like people touching the piano, but what harm could it do? She shrugged lightly. "Sure," she said. "Go ahead, but don't expect much sound from that thing." He smiled, a small, almost shy smile, and stood up. His steps were slow but steady as he walked to the corner. He pulled out the piano stool, sat down, and ran his fingers gently over the keys as if greeting an old friend. The waitress went back to the counter, expecting a few random notes. But then it happened. The moment he pressed the first key, the diner changed. The air seemed to still, the sound wrapping around every corner of the room. The melody was soft at first, uncertain, but soon it grew, smooth, flowing, full of feeling. The customers stopped talking. Even the cook stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. The waitress stood frozen. She couldn't believe it. The man's hands moved gracefully, like he had been born for it. The music wasn't just beautiful, it was full of something deeper. Sadness, hope, pain, and peace all mixed together in every note. The sound filled the small diner, echoing softly off the walls. For a few minutes, everyone forgot the rain, their worries, and even who the man was. They just listened. When the last note faded away, there was a silence that felt almost heavy. Then one of the customers started clapping slowly. The others followed. The man turned around, a little embarrassed, and lowered his head. The waitress felt her heart beating faster. "That was amazing," she said, walking closer. "How did you learn to play like that?" He looked at the piano, his fingers still resting lightly on the keys. "It's been a long time," he said softly. "I used to play every day, but life took me away from it." She wanted to ask more, but she could see in his eyes that the memories hurt. So she didn't. She just smiled and said, "Well, you still got it." He chuckled quietly. "Thank you for letting me play. And for the food. It's been a while since someone showed me kindness without asking for anything back." The waitress felt her throat tighten a little. "Sometimes people just need a little kindness," she said simply. "That's all." He nodded, his eyes warm. "I'll remember that." He stayed for a while longer, just sitting by the piano, his hands resting on his lap. The other customers eventually left. The cook went back to the kitchen and the rain continued outside. The waitress started stacking plates, glancing at him now and then. Before leaving, the man walked up to the counter. "If I come by again," he asked softly, "could I play again? Maybe I can help draw in some customers for you." She smiled. "You can play anytime you want." He nodded, his eyes shining for the first time that night. "You have a kind heart," he said. "Don't lose it." And with that, he walked out into the rain, disappearing into the night. The waitress stood by the window watching him go. Something about him lingered in her mind long after he was gone. The sound of his music, the sadness in his smile, the quiet dignity in his eyes. She didn't know who he was or where he came from, but she felt deep down that there was more to his story than what she saw. As she turned off the lights and locked the diner door, the echo of his melody still played softly in her head. She didn't know that this simple act of kindness, this one rainy night, would soon change everything. Not just for him, but for her too. The next morning, the waitress couldn't stop thinking about the man from the night before. Even while she poured coffee or took orders, his music stayed in her mind. The sound of the piano had felt almost like magic, and she kept wondering who he really was. Most people who came into the diner were regulars, folks she'd seen 100 times. But he was different. Quiet, gentle, and yet there had been something powerful behind his eyes. When the clock hit 8, the morning rush began. Truck drivers, office workers, and tired mothers with kids came in, filling the place with chatter and the smell of breakfast. The waitress smiled and did her best to keep up. But every time she looked at the corner where the piano stood, she found herself hoping the man would walk in again. By noon, he still hadn't come. She told herself he was probably gone, maybe looking for shelter somewhere else, maybe traveling to another town. Still, she felt a little disappointed. 2 days passed before she saw him again. It was another rainy evening. The diner was half empty, the sky outside gray and heavy. When the door opened and that same figure stepped inside, her heart lifted a little. His clothes were still the same, though a little drier this time, and he carried a small paper bag. He looked shy, almost unsure if he should be there. "You came back," she said softly as he approached the counter. He smiled faintly. "I hope that's all right." "Of course it is," she said quickly. "You can sit wherever you like." He nodded and took the same corner booth as before. He placed the small paper bag on the table and looked toward the piano again. It was as if he couldn't help it. She brought him some coffee, and when she set the cup down, he said, "I wanted to say thank you again for the meal the other night." "You didn't have to do that." She shook her head. "It's okay. I'm glad you got something warm to eat. You played beautifully. People are still talking about it." He smiled but didn't say anything right away. After a moment, he pulled something out of the paper bag. a small loaf of bread wrapped in a napkin. He pushed it toward her. "I baked this at the shelter where I stay," he said. "It's not much, but I wanted to give something back." The gesture caught her off guard. She wasn't used to kindness coming back her way. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "But I wanted to." She accepted the bread with a small smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's really kind." They stood there for a moment, the rain tapping against the windows again, and for some reason, the diner felt warmer than usual. When things slowed down later that evening, he asked if he could play again. She nodded right away, even before he finished asking. As soon as he sat at the piano, the sound filled the room once more. But this time the music was different. It was lighter, more hopeful, like a sunrise breaking through clouds. The few customers in the diner turned in their seats. Even the cook leaned against the doorway to listen. When he finished, the room fell quiet again before soft clapping filled the air. He looked embarrassed, rubbing his hands together like he didn't know what to do with all the attention. The waitress walked over, smiling. "You make it sound like a new piano," she said. He chuckled softly. "It's not the piano," he said. "It's what it means. When I play, it feels like remembering who I was before life got heavy." She looked at him curiously. "Were you a musician before?" He paused for a long time, his gaze distant. "You could say that," he replied. "Music used to be my world. I played in places you wouldn't believe. But I lost someone who used to listen to every note I played. After that, I couldn't play anymore." His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it that made her chest tighten. She didn't want to push, so she simply nodded and said, "Sometimes music finds us again when we need it most." He looked at her for a moment, as if those words meant more than she realized. When it was closing time, she packed up the leftover food like she always did. Before leaving, she handed him a small bag. "There's some stew and bread in here," she said. "You can take it with you. It's cold tonight." He shook his head. "You've already done too much," she smiled. "It's just food. Don't argue." He laughed quietly, a warm, genuine sound. "All right," he said. "Thank you again." She watched him walk into the rain once more, his figure slowly fading into the night. She didn't know why she cared so much, but something about him stayed in her thoughts long after he was gone. Over the next few weeks, he started coming by often, sometimes every few days, sometimes just once a week. Every time he came, he'd play the piano, and the diner would fill with music that drew people in from the street. Some came just to listen. Others came because they heard the story of the homeless man who could play like a professional. The waitress noticed how people's attitudes toward him began to change. The same customers who once rolled their eyes when he walked in now greeted him with nods and smiles. Even the cook started leaving small plates of food out for him without complaint. One afternoon, a man in a suit stopped by after hearing the music from outside. He listened for a while and then asked the waitress, "Who is he? Where did he learn to play like that?" She just smiled. "He never really said," she replied. "He just showed up one rainy night." The man in the suit shook his head in amazement. "He's incredible," he said. "You don't find that kind of soul in music anymore." After the man left, the waitress noticed the player looking down at the keys quietly. "You could play anywhere, you know," she said. "You don't belong out there." He looked up slowly. "Maybe not," he said. "But for now, this feels right." She didn't understand what he meant, but she didn't ask. Sometimes silence said more than words. One evening, as they were closing, he helped her stack chairs. She thanked him, and he smiled. "You remind me of someone I once knew," he said softly. "Who?" she asked. "She had a small cafe," he said. "She believed that people could change with a little kindness. She used to tell me that no one is truly lost if they still have a song in their heart." The waitress smiled faintly. "She sounds wise." "She was," he said quietly. "She was also my wife." The air went still for a moment. The waitress didn't know what to say. She could see the pain flicker across his face before he quickly looked away. "She passed away," he added, his voice low. "After that, I stopped playing. I stopped everything. I didn't know who I was without her." The waitress put a gentle hand on the counter close to his. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "but I think she'd be proud to see you play again." He smiled weakly. Maybe she would. They stood there quietly for a while as the sound of rain began again outside. The following days were busy. More people came in because of the music, and the diner started earning better tips. The owner even noticed and asked the waitress about it. She just smiled and said, "It's the music. It makes people feel something." The owner shrugged but didn't complain. As long as business was good, he was happy. One night, after a long shift, the waitress locked the doors and sat by the piano herself. She pressed one key gently, listening to the sound fade. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. She realized how much life had changed since that man had walked in. The diner felt brighter. People seemed kinder. Even she felt lighter somehow. She wondered where he went when he wasn't here. Maybe the shelter, maybe the park benches downtown. Wherever he was, she hoped he was safe. A few days later, she noticed he didn't show up. One day passed, then two. The piano sat quiet, the air somehow emptier without his music. By the third evening, she began to worry. She told herself not to, it wasn't her place, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something might have happened. When the door finally opened again late one night, she turned quickly, hoping it was him. And it was. But something was different this time. He looked cleaner. His hair was cut, his beard trimmed, and his clothes, though simple, looked new. There was a calm confidence in his walk that hadn't been there before. He smiled at her gently. "Mind if I play one more time?" She nodded, too surprised to speak. When his fingers touched the keys, the melody was soft but full of light, like someone had found their way home. And as she listened, she felt something she couldn't explain, like a chapter was ending but another was about to begin. The diner was quieter than usual that night. Only a few people sat at the tables talking softly while the rain whispered outside. The waitress moved between booths, wiping tables and refilling coffee cups, but her eyes kept drifting toward the man at the piano. He looked different now. His face was clean, his clothes were neat, and the tired look that once filled his eyes seemed to have softened. There was still sadness there, but it was no longer the kind that dragged him down. It was the kind that carried memories. When he started to play, the sound filled the small diner once again. This time it wasn't heavy with sorrow or light with hope. It was something in between, something that spoke of acceptance. The melody was gentle, warm, and so full of feeling that even the cook stopped pretending not to listen. The waitress leaned against the counter, quietly watching. She didn't understand how someone could play like that, how fingers that had once trembled from hunger could now move so gracefully, like they were painting stories in sound. When the last note faded, the customers clapped softly, and the man gave a small nod of thanks before standing up. The waitress walked over, smiling. "You've been practicing," she said kindly. He chuckled. "I guess I have," he replied. "Sometimes I go to the community center in the mornings. They have an old piano there too. It keeps me company," she nodded. "You sound happier." He paused for a moment. "Maybe I am," he said. "You know, I used to think music had left me forever. But lately I've started to realize it was never gone. I just stopped listening." The way he said it made her heart ache a little. She could tell he wasn't just talking about music. He was talking about life. After closing time, when the lights were dim and only the rain kept them company, he helped her stack the chairs again. She liked that he always offered to help even though he didn't have to. "You know," he said quietly as he placed a chair upside down on the table, "you remind me of my son sometimes. He was about your age when I last saw him." The waitress froze for a second. She hadn't known he had a son. "Do you still see him?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No, he passed away. A long time ago." She felt her chest tighten. "I'm so sorry," she said gently. He gave a faint smile, though his eyes turned distant. "He used to sit by the piano when I practiced," he said. He'd fall asleep on the couch with a blanket, listening to every note. I didn't know then that those were the best days of my life. The waitress didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Sometimes silence was the kindest thing you could offer someone's pain. He looked at her and said softly, "The night you let me eat here, I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. I'd stopped believing that kindness still existed." "You changed that." She swallowed hard, feeling tears burn the corners of her eyes. "I just did what anyone should do," she said quietly. He smiled, but his eyes said he knew better. "Most people don't," he said. "But you did." The next day he came again, this time in the afternoon. The sun had come out for the first time in a week, casting golden light through the diner windows. The waitress was surprised to see him so early. "You're up bright and early," she said playfully. He smiled. "I wanted to try something different," he said. A happier tune, maybe. When he sat down and began to play, the sound was completely different. It was light and cheerful, with a rhythm that made people tap their feet without realizing. A little boy who had come in with his mother started clapping along, and the man smiled as he played faster, matching the boy's beat. The diner filled with laughter for the first time in a long time. Even the cook, who usually frowned at everything, leaned out the kitchen window to watch. When the song ended, everyone applauded, and the man stood to take a small, awkward bow. The waitress couldn't help but laugh. "Look at you," she said. "You've got fans now," he grinned. "Feels nice," he said. "It's been years since anyone clapped for me." Later, while cleaning a table, she overheard two customers talking about him. "Did you hear that man used to play for big crowds?" One said. "Someone said he was famous once." The other shook his head. "Nah, can't be. He's just some guy who lost his way." But the waitress wasn't so sure anymore. Something told her the truth might be closer to the first story. That night, after everyone had gone, she finally asked him the question that had been sitting on her heart. "Were you really a professional musician?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I used to play in concert halls," he said quietly. "I had everything once, money, fame, a family. But when I lost them, none of it mattered anymore. I walked away from it all." She listened carefully. "And now?" she asked. He smiled gently. "Now I just want to play again because it makes me feel alive. It reminds me that I'm still here." She nodded, understanding more than she could say. Over the following weeks, word about the piano man spread. People began stopping by just to hear him play. Some nights the diner was so full that there weren't enough seats. The owner was thrilled, of course, though he pretended it was just luck. The waitress noticed how the man seemed different every time he played. He laughed more now, talked to people, and even joked with the regulars. He'd become part of the diner's life, almost like family. One evening, after a particularly busy night, the waitress handed him a small envelope. "The owner wanted me to give this to you," she said. "It's a little payment for bringing people in." He looked at the envelope for a long time before shaking his head. "I can't take it." "You earned it," she said. "You've helped this place more than you know." He hesitated again, but finally accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you." When he left that night, he stopped at the door and looked back. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think my story had ended. But maybe it's just changing chapters," she smiled. "That's what life does," she said. "It surprises us when we least expect it." The days that followed were bright ones. The man came often, and each time he played, the music seemed to heal something in everyone who listened. People who came in angry left smiling. Strangers talked to each other. The diner felt alive. But one Friday evening, as the waitress walked to work, she noticed a crowd gathered outside. A man in a dark suit was standing by a fancy black car talking to the piano man. The waitress slowed her steps, unsure what was happening. When she entered, the man in the suit was gone, and the pianist was sitting silently at the piano, staring at the keys. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. He looked up slowly. "That was an old friend," he said. "He used to manage my shows back when I was performing." Her eyes widened. "He recognized you?" He nodded. "Yes. He said they've been looking for me for years. Apparently some people still remember my name." She smiled softly. "That's wonderful, isn't it?" He gave a small, uncertain nod. "Maybe. But it also means I have to decide if I'm ready to go back." She said nothing for a moment, then replied, "You don't have to decide right away. Sometimes the heart knows when it's ready." He smiled faintly. "You sound like my wife," he said quietly. She used to say things like that. That night when he played, the music carried a strange feeling, half joy, half goodbye. The waitress felt it too, though she didn't say anything. She just watched, her hands folded over her apron, knowing something was changing. After the last note faded, he looked up at her and said, "If I leave someday, I hope you'll keep this piano alive. It deserves to be played." She nodded slowly, not trusting her voice to speak. When he walked out into the cool night air, she watched him go with a feeling she couldn't name, something between pride and sadness. The rain had stopped. The moonlight caught the wet pavement, and for a long moment, she could still hear his melody echoing softly in her mind. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she had a feeling it wouldn't be the same again. The next few days passed quietly. The man didn't come to the diner. and the waitress noticed the absence right away. The piano sat silently in the corner, collecting dust again. It felt strange how something as simple as a sound could leave such a big emptiness behind. Every time she walked past the piano, she would glance at it, half expecting to see him sitting there again, smiling softly before his fingers danced over the keys. But he didn't show up. One evening, as she was cleaning the counter, the cook said, "That man brought us luck, you know. Ever since he started playing, this place felt different." She nodded slowly. Yeah, it really did. She didn't say it out loud, but she missed him. Not just his music, but the quiet peace he brought with him. There was something about his presence that made the place feel warmer. A few days later, just as she was about to close the diner for the night, the door opened and he walked in. He looked calm but thoughtful, wearing the same neat clothes he'd worn the last time. His eyes carried that same quiet kindness, though now they also held something deeper, something like decision. "You're back," she said softly, trying not to sound too relieved. "I am," he said with a small smile. "I've been thinking a lot." She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter. "About what?" He looked toward the piano. "About life. About music. About whether it's time to stop hiding from my past." The waitress listened carefully. He rarely spoke so openly. "What did you decide?" she asked. He sighed lightly. "I think I've spent too long running from who I used to be. Maybe it's time to face it." She smiled faintly. "Maybe it is, but you don't have to face it alone." He nodded, touched by her words. "Thank you. You've been kind to me in ways you probably don't even realize." Before she could answer, he walked to the piano and sat down. His hands hovered over the keys for a long moment before he began to play. The music that came out that night was different. It wasn't just beautiful, it was storytelling without words. Every note carried a memory. Every pause felt like a breath from the past. It was like listening to a man make peace with everything he'd lost. People walking outside stopped by the windows, drawn by the sound. Even the cook came out and stood still, not saying a word. When the last note faded, the diner was silent. Then slowly the waitress clapped, followed by everyone else. He smiled quietly, then looked up at her. "That was for them," he said softly. "For who?" she asked. "For my wife and son," he replied. "For the people I lost. I think it's time I stopped living like a ghost." His words hung in the air. The waitress could see the relief in his eyes, a man finally letting go of the weight he'd carried for too long. He stayed late that night, helping her close up like always. They talked as they worked, their voices quiet but warm. "Do you ever wonder why life takes things away from us?" he asked suddenly. She paused. "All the time," she said honestly. "But I also think sometimes it gives us something new to help us heal. Maybe that's what you got from the piano again." He smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what I got from you," he said. Her cheeks warmed at the kindness in his tone. "I didn't do much," she said shyly. "You gave me back a piece of myself," he said simply. "That's more than enough." The next day he came again, but this time he brought someone with him. A man in a gray suit followed him in, carrying a briefcase and looking around the small diner with curious eyes. The waitress watched as they sat down together and spoke quietly for a while. She couldn't hear their words, but she noticed the pianist's calm smile and the way the suited man nodded respectfully several times. When she came to take their order, the suited man stood and extended his hand. "You must be the waitress," he said warmly. "I've heard a lot about you." She blinked, a little confused. "About me?" "Yes," he said, smiling. "This man tells me you helped him when no one else would. That you gave him food, kindness, and a place to play when he had nothing." She looked at the pianist, who just smiled gently. "I'm his business partner," the suited man explained. "We've been trying to find him for years. He disappeared after a personal loss. He was one of the most gifted musicians this country has ever seen." The waitress stared at him in disbelief. "You mean he really was?" The suited man nodded. "Yes. He's the founder of one of the biggest music foundations in the city. But after his family passed, he walked away from everything." Her eyes turned to the man sitting quietly at the piano, now looking at her with a small, humble smile. "I didn't want anyone to know," he said softly. "I needed to disappear for a while, to remember what life felt like without all the noise." The waitress was speechless. She had never imagined the man she'd fed on that rainy night was someone who had once lived a life of fame and fortune. The suited man continued. He's decided to return to music again, to rebuild what he left behind. And he wanted me to meet the person who reminded him why kindness still matters. She felt a lump in her throat. I just did what anyone would have done, she said quietly. But both men smiled, as if they knew better. Later that evening, after the suited man left, she sat with the pianist at the counter, both of them sipping tea. The air felt still, almost peaceful. I didn't mean to keep that from you, he said softly. I just wanted to be seen as a person, not a name. She nodded. You don't owe me an explanation, she said. You're still the same person who played that first night. He smiled gratefully. That means more than you know. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of rain returning outside. Finally, he said, I'm leaving for the city in a few days. They're planning a charity concert to reopen the foundation. I want to play again, not for money or fame, but to help others who are lost like I was. Her heart sank a little, though she tried to hide it. That's wonderful, she said. You should. People need to hear you play. He looked at her gently. Would you come? Me? She asked, surprised. He nodded. Yes, you were there when no one else was. I'd like you to hear me play again. This time, not in a diner, but on a real stage. She hesitated, then smiled. I'd be honored. Over the next few days, the diner felt busier, but quieter in her heart. She knew he would be leaving soon, and though she was proud of him, the thought of not seeing him every day made her chest ache. On his last evening before leaving, he came by one final time. The diner was nearly empty. He sat at the piano and she watched from behind the counter, trying to memorize every moment. He began to play a song unlike any he had played before. Soft, gentle, full of warmth. It sounded like gratitude and farewell wrapped into one. When the song ended, he stood and walked to her. That was for you, he said. For your kindness. For reminding me that even the smallest act of compassion can change a life. She blinked back tears. I didn't do anything special, she whispered. He smiled softly. You did everything. He left a small envelope on the counter. Don't open it now, he said. Wait until I'm gone. And then, with one last nod, he walked out into the night. The waitress stood by the window, watching him disappear down the quiet street, the rain falling gently once again. She felt a strange mix of sadness and peace, as if she knew their paths had crossed for a reason. When she finally opened the envelope later, there was a short letter inside, written in neat handwriting. It said, For the kindness that asked for nothing, for the heart that gave freely, you reminded me that music still lives where compassion does. This diner will always be my favorite stage, and tucked behind the letter was a simple card with an invitation to his concert. The waitress smiled through her tears. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that her life too was about to change forever. The day of the concert came faster than she had expected. The waitress stood in front of the grand concert hall, holding the invitation in her hand. The golden lights from the entrance reflected on the wet pavement as people arrived in elegant clothes, smiling and chatting. She looked down at her plain dress and her small shoes, feeling a little out of place. But she took a deep breath and stepped inside anyway. The hall was huge, filled with rows of red velvet seats and tall ceilings that made every sound echo softly. A man guided her to her seat near the front, close enough to see the stage clearly. She had never been anywhere so grand before. The lights, the crowd, the sound of quiet whispers, it all felt like another world compared to the little diner she worked in. She clutched the invitation tightly. It still amazed her that the man who had once walked into her diner, tired and hungry, was now the one everyone had come to see. She thought about the simple nights he played for a meal, and the way his music had changed the mood of everyone around him. Now the same man was about to play again, but this time the whole world would listen. When the lights dimmed, the hall went completely silent. A single spotlight shone on the grand piano at the center of the stage. Then slowly he walked out. He looked calm and confident, wearing a black suit that seemed to belong to another version of him, the man he once was before his loss. But there was still a touch of that humble gentleness in the way he moved. The same kindness that she remembered from the diner. The crowd applauded warmly, and he smiled softly in return. Before he sat down, he stepped toward the microphone and spoke. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. Thank you for being here tonight. For many years I stopped playing. I lost people I loved, and with them, I lost the music in my heart. I walked away from everything because I thought I had nothing left to give. The audience listened in silence. He continued, "But then one day, I walked into a small diner on a rainy night. I had no home, no plan, no strength left to keep going. A woman there gave me food without asking for anything in return. She didn't know who I was. She only saw a man who needed kindness, and that simple act brought me back to life." A quiet murmur moved through the audience. The waitress froze in her seat, her heart beating faster. She didn't expect him to talk about her, not in front of everyone. He smiled gently as if he knew she was out there somewhere. "This concert," he said, "is not about fame or success. It's about kindness. It's about remembering that the smallest acts of care can change a person's life. So tonight I want to dedicate this performance to that woman, and to everyone who still believes in kindness." The audience clapped softly. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. He turned to the piano and sat down. The hall went still. Then he began to play. The first note was soft, almost like a whisper. The melody started slow, filled with warmth, building layer by layer into something rich and deep. The music told a story, the story of loss, wandering, and finding light again. The waitress sat completely still, her eyes locked on him. She could hear the pain in the early notes, the struggle, the loneliness. But as the piece went on, she could hear hope returning. It was like hearing someone's soul slowly heal in front of everyone. When the final note echoed into silence, the entire hall stood up at once. The applause was thunderous. People clapped, cheered, and shouted his name. Some threw flowers on the stage. But his eyes searched the crowd until he found her. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he smiled softly. Just a small, grateful smile that said everything words couldn't. After the concert ended, she waited quietly near the side door where only a few guests were allowed. She wasn't sure if she should stay, but her heart wouldn't let her leave without saying goodbye. A few minutes later, he appeared. He looked different under the bright hallway lights, tired but peaceful, as if a heavy burden had finally lifted from his shoulders. When he saw her, his face lit up. "You came?" he said warmly. "Of course," she replied, smiling. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." He chuckled softly. "I wasn't sure you'd want to come to a place like this." She shrugged lightly. "Maybe it's not my world, but you're my friend and I wanted to see you do what you were meant to do." For a moment he just looked at her, as if trying to find the right words. Then he said quietly, "I don't think I could have done this without you. You reminded me what music is really about." She smiled gently. "I didn't do much. You already had it inside you. You just needed to believe in it again." He nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "You're wrong about one thing," he said. "You did everything." They stood in silence for a few seconds, the soft hum of voices from other guests filling the background. Then someone called his name, asking him to join a group of reporters waiting outside. He sighed softly. "Duty calls, I guess," he said with a small smile. "But before I go," he reached into his pocket and handed her another small envelope. "Don't open this until you get home," he said. "And please don't say no to what's inside." She looked down at it, confused. "What is it?" he smiled. "You'll see." Before she could ask more, he was pulled away by the organizers. She watched as he disappeared into the crowd again, surrounded by cameras and reporters. He looked comfortable now, like he had finally returned to the world that once belonged to him, but this time, with peace instead of pain. She left quietly, walking down the street with the envelope clutched in her hand. The city lights reflected in the puddles, and though her heart felt heavy, it was also full. When she reached home, she sat by the small window and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and another card. The letter read, "When I had nothing, you gave me everything that truly mattered. Kindness, hope, and a reason to play again. I've decided to create something new, something that will help people who are struggling just like I was. I want you to be part of it." She unfolded the card and read the printed words. "Invitation. Opening of the Harmony Foundation for Music and Hope. Partner and manager, her name." Her hands trembled slightly. She couldn't believe what she was reading. He wasn't just thanking her. He wanted her to be a part of his new life, to help others through music. She sat there for a long time, staring at the letter, her eyes filling with tears. For so long she had worked in that small diner, living quietly, thinking her life didn't matter much beyond serving coffee and wiping tables. But one act of kindness had changed everything. Not just for him, but for her too. The next morning, she went back to work as usual. The diner felt the same. The smell of coffee, the sound of plates clinking. But she felt different inside. As she served a regular customer, the cook looked up from the grill and said, "Hey, did you hear about that big concert last night? That piano guy? Everyone's talking about him." She smiled quietly. "Yeah," she said softly. "I heard." Later that day, as she was wiping down the counter, the door opened. She turned, half expecting it to be just another customer, but it was him. He stood in the doorway, holding a small bouquet of white flowers and smiling. "I told them I needed one last stop before my flight," he said. She laughed softly. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he replied, walking closer. "I wanted to say thank you again. In person." He placed the flowers on the counter and looked around the diner, the place where everything had started. "This place saved me," he said quietly. "You saved me." She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a meal." He smiled. Sometimes a meal is all it takes to remind someone that they still matter. They shared a quiet moment, both understanding how far they had come. Then he said softly, "I'll see you soon at the foundation." She nodded, smiling through misty eyes. "I'll be there." He turned to leave, but before stepping out, he looked back once more and said, "Don't ever think small kindness doesn't matter. You proved it does." Then he was gone again, walking out into the bright morning sunlight. The waitress stood there for a long time, staring at the door. The world outside looked a little brighter than before, the sky a little clearer. She went back to work with a light heart, knowing that her simple kindness had changed not just one man's life, but her own as well. Would you like me to continue and write part 6, around 1,400 words next, where the story concludes with, a few weeks passed and life began to feel different for the waitress. She still worked at the diner, but every morning felt lighter now. She had something new to look forward to, something that made her believe her kindness had a bigger purpose. One morning, as she poured coffee for a regular, she looked up and saw a man walking toward the diner door. It was the same driver who had come with the pianist once before. He smiled politely as he entered, holding an envelope in his hand. "Good morning," he said kindly. "He asked me to deliver this to you." Her heart skipped a beat. She wiped her hands quickly and took the envelope. "Thank you," she said softly. She opened it right there at the counter. Inside was a simple note written in his familiar handwriting. "The foundation opens this Saturday. The world will hear new music again, and I want you there beside me, just like you were the first time. Your ticket is enclosed." She felt her throat tighten. The foundation wasn't just another concert. It was the dream he had told her about, a place where struggling musicians could find help and a second chance, just like he had found his. The next few days went by quickly. She worked double shifts to finish early and save enough for a new dress. It wasn't anything fancy, just a plain, soft blue one she found in a small store downtown. She didn't want to stand out. She just wanted to be there to support him. When Saturday arrived, she took a deep breath before stepping out of the cab in front of the new building. The Harmony Foundation stood tall and bright, its glass walls reflecting the afternoon sun. People were gathered outside dressed in elegant clothes, talking and laughing. A banner hung across the entrance. Harmony Foundation for Music and Hope, opening ceremony. She stood for a moment, taking it all in. Then she walked inside. The air inside buzzed with excitement. There were journalists, photographers, and musicians from all over the city. But the moment she saw him across the room, standing near the stage, everything else faded away. He looked completely at peace now, his posture confident, his smile warm. When he noticed her, his face brightened immediately. He walked over quickly, looking both proud and grateful. "You came," he said softly. "I told you I would," she replied with a smile. He looked at her for a moment before saying, "You look perfect," she laughed lightly. "I'm just me." "That's enough," he nodded. "That's exactly what makes it perfect." The ceremony began soon after. The mayor gave a short speech about the importance of art and kindness. Then the pianist was invited to the stage to say a few words. As he walked to the microphone, the room grew quiet. He looked out over the crowd, his hands resting calmly on the stand. "When I lost my family," he began, I also lost myself. I had everything that money could buy, but nothing that could fill the emptiness inside. So I disappeared. I wandered the streets searching for something I couldn't name. One night I walked into a small diner, cold and hungry. I didn't know it then, but that was the night everything began to change. The crowd listened closely. He glanced toward her for just a moment, then continued. A woman there showed me kindness. She didn't ask who I was or what I had. She just gave me a meal and let me play her piano, and in that moment I remembered who I was. Her kindness reminded me that music isn't about fame or fortune. It's about connection. It's about people. He paused, emotion rising in his voice. This foundation is dedicated to her and to all those who believe that compassion can bring people back to life. Every note we'll play here will carry a piece of that belief. The audience began to applaud softly, touched by his words. She felt her eyes sting with tears but quickly blinked them away. After the speech, the lights dimmed and he sat at the piano. The hall was silent again, just like it had been at the concert. This time, though, the music felt brighter, freer. Every note carried joy, like sunlight spilling through a window after a storm. The piece built slowly, then lifted into something powerful. People began to close their eyes, swaying gently as if the music wrapped around them. When he finished, the entire room rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. But he didn't bask in the applause. Instead, he stood and motioned for her to come up. She froze in surprise, shaking her head slightly. But he smiled and nodded again. Come, he mouthed. Her heart raced, but she stepped forward slowly. The crowd watched curiously as she walked up the small staircase. When she reached him, he whispered softly, You belong here too. He turned to the microphone and said, This is the person who reminded me what music means. She believed in a stranger when no one else did. This foundation wouldn't exist without her. The audience clapped again, louder this time. She felt her cheeks grow warm, embarrassed but deeply moved. He handed her a small key attached to a ribbon. This is yours, he said. It opens the door to your office upstairs. You're not just a guest here, you're part of this. Her mouth fell open slightly. My office? She whispered. He smiled. You'll help manage the foundation. I meant every word of that letter. You have the heart this place needs. She couldn't speak for a moment. Tears welled in her eyes. I don't know what to say, she finally whispered. Just say you'll stay, he said gently. She nodded slowly, smiling through her tears. I'll stay. The rest of the evening felt like a dream. Guests came to congratulate them both. Photographers took pictures and music filled every corner of the building. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. Later, when the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, he found her standing alone by the piano. Do you remember the first night I played in the diner? He asked softly. She smiled. Of course I do. You asked if you could play for food. He chuckled. And you said yes, even though you didn't know me. I didn't need to, she said. You looked like someone who needed to be seen. He nodded slowly, his eyes warm. And you looked like someone who could see beyond what others couldn't. They both laughed quietly. He sat down and began to play a gentle tune, one she recognized right away. The same simple melody he had played that very first night in the diner. But this time it sounded new, filled with light. She closed her eyes, listening, remembering everything they had gone through. The rain, the empty nights, the music, the kindness that had changed both their lives. When the song ended, he looked up at her. This is where it all began, he said. A small act that grew into something I could never imagine. She smiled softly. Sometimes the smallest things matter the most. He nodded. Yes, they do. As the night drew to a close, they stood together in front of the grand windows overlooking the city. The lights below twinkled like stars, and the sound of faint laughter filled the hall. He turned to her. Do you know what I realized? What? She asked. That kindness and music are the same, he said. They both start in the heart and find their way to others. She looked at him, her eyes gentle. And they never really fade, do they? He smiled. No, they just keep echoing. They stood there in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. For her, it was a moment of quiet pride. She had once been just a waitress in a small diner, serving strangers day after day. But because she chose kindness once, her world had changed forever. And for him, it was peace, the kind he had searched for all those years. The music he thought he'd lost had returned, not because of fame or fortune, but because of one person's compassion. As they left the hall together, The night air was cool and calm. The streetlights cast soft glows on the sidewalk. He looked up at the sky and said, "Do you hear that?" She tilted her head. "Hear what?" He smiled faintly. "The city, it hums like a song now." She laughed softly. "Maybe it's your music still playing in people's hearts." He looked at her warmly. "Or maybe it's yours." They walked side by side down the quiet street, their footsteps light, the sound of distant music fading gently into the night. And though the city around them kept moving, they both knew one simple truth: kindness, no matter how small, can create the most beautiful music of all.